Hi, first graders. It's Mrs. Kuiper with our Read Aloud, The Absent Author. We started this before our long break, and so I'm going to keep reading some of the chapters to you so you can find out what happened to Wallace Wallace. Here we go. Chapter 5. Back on Main Street, Dink adjusted his backpack and led the way to the Shangri-La Hotel. Maureen Higgins said she dropped him off at the hotel last night, he told the others, so that's our next stop. What if she didn't? Josh said, catching up to Dink. What do you mean? I mean, maybe Maureen Higgins wasn't telling the truth. Maybe she kidnapped him. And she's hiding him in her lunchbox, Ruth Rose said. Very funny, Ruth Rose, Josh said. Maureen Higgins said she drove Wallace Wallace to the hotel. But what if she drove him somewhere else? You could be right, Dink said. That's why we're going to the hotel. With Dink in the lead, the four approached the check-in counter in the hotel lobby. Excuse me, Dink said to the man behind the counter. May we help you? He was the saddest-looking man Dink had ever seen. He had thin black hair and droopy eyebrows. His skinny mustache looked like a sleeping centipede. A name tag on his suit coat said, Mr. Linkletter. We're looking for someone. Mr. Linkletter stared at Dink. He's supposed to be staying in this hotel, Josh said. The man twitched his mustache at Josh. His name is Wallace Wallace, Dink explained. Can you tell us if he checked in last night? Mr. Linkletter patted his mustache. Young sir, if we had such a guest, we wouldn't give out any information. We have rules at the Shangri-La, he added in a deep, sad voice. But he's missing, Ruth Rose said. He was supposed to be at the Book Nook this morning and he never showed up. Dink pulled out the itinerary. See, he was coming here from the airport. The taxi driver said she saw him walk into this lobby. And he's famous, Ruth Rose said. She placed her book on the counter in front of Mr. Linkletter. He wrote this. Sighing, Mr. Linkletter looked down at Ruth Rose. We are quite aware of who Mr. Wallace is, young miss. Mr. Linkletter turned his sad eyes back at Dink. He flipped through the hotel register, glanced at it, then quickly shut the book. Yes, Mr. Wallace checked in, he said. He arrived at 8:05. He did? What happened after that? Dink asked. Mr. Linkletter pointed toward a bank of elevators. He went to his room. We offered to have his suitcase carried, but he preferred to do it himself. Have you seen Mr. Wallace yet today? Mavis asked. No, madam, I haven't seen him. Mr. Wallace is still in his room. Still in his room. Suddenly, Dink felt relieved. He felt a little foolish, too. Wallace Wallace hadn't been kidnapped after all. He was probably in his room right now. Can you call him? Dink asked. Mr. Linkletter tapped his fingers on the closed hotel register. He patted his mustache and squinted his eyes at Dink. Please, Dink said. We just want to make sure he's okay. Finally, Mr. Linkletter turned around. He stepped a few feet away and picked up a red telephone. As soon as his back was turned, Josh grabbed the hotel register. He quickly found yesterday's page. Dink and the others crowded around Josh for a peek. Dink immediately recognized Wallace Wallace's signature, scrawled in big, loopy letters. He had checked in to room 303 at 8:05 last night. Dink pulled out his letter from Wallace Wallace and compared the two signatures. They were exactly the same. Josh dug his elbow into Dink's side. Look, he whispered. Josh was pointing at the next line in the register. Room 302 had been printed there. Check-in time was 8:15. Someone else checked in right after Wallace Wallace, Rose whispered. But the signature is all smudged, Dink said. I can't read the name. When Mr. Linkletter hung up the phone, Josh shoved the register away. As Mr. Linkletter turned back around, Dink shut the register. He looked up innocently. Is he in his room? Dink asked. I don't know. Mr. Linkletter tapped his fingers on his mustache. There was no answer. Dink's stomach dropped. His mind raced. If Wallace Wallace had checked into his room last night, Why hadn't he shown up at the book nook today? And why wasn't he answering his phone? Maybe Wallace Wallace had been kidnapped after all. That's the end of chapter 5. Here's a picture that was in the chapter. So that's the man at the hotel, and then there's the 3 kids. I want you to think right now, how would you feel if you were those kids? You think about it. I know if I was those kids, I would be a little nervous and a little anxious and maybe even a little scared. Let's see what happens in chapter 6. Chapter 6. Dink stared at Mr. Linkletter. No answer? Are you sure? Mr. Linkletter nodded. He looked puzzled. Perhaps he's resting and doesn't want to be disturbed. Can we go up and see? Ruth Rose smiled sweetly at Mr. Linkletter. Then we'd know for sure. Mr. Linkletter shook his head. We cannot disturb our guests, young miss. We have rules at the Shangri-La. Now, good day and thank you. Ruth Rose opened her mouth. But, Miss, good day, Mr. Linkletter said firmly again. Dink and the others walked toward the door. Something smells fishy, muttered Dink. Yeah, Josh said, and I think it's that Linkletter guy. See how he tried to hide the register? Then he turned his back. Maybe he didn't even call room 303. Maybe he was warning his partners in crime. What are you suggesting, Josh? Mavis asked. Maybe Mr. Linkletter is the kidnapper, Josh said. He was the last one to see Wallace Wallace. A man wearing a red cap tapped Dink on the shoulder. Excuse me, but I overheard you talking to my boss, Mr. Linkletter. Maybe I can help you find Wallace Wallace. My kids love his books. Great, Dink said. Can you get us into his room? The man shook his head. No, but I know the maid who cleaned the 3rd floor rooms this morning. Maybe she noticed something. With his back to Mr. Linkletter, the man scribbled a few words on a pad and handed the page to Dink. Good luck, the man whispered and hurried away. What'd he write? Josh asked. Outside, Dink said. They all shoved through the revolving door. In front of the hotel, Dink looked at the piece of paper. The maid's name is Olivia Nugent. She lives at the Acorn Apartments, number 4. Libby Nugent? I know her, Ruth Rose said. She used to be my babysitter. The Acorn is right around the corner on Oak Street, Dink said. Let's go. Soon all 4 were standing in front of Libby Nugent's door. She answered it with a baby in her arms. Another little kid held onto her leg and stared at Dink and the others. He had peanut butter all over his face and in his hair. Hi, the boy's mother said. I'm not buying any cookies, and I already get the Green Lawn Gazette. She was wearing a man's blue shirt and jeans. Her brown hair stuck out from under a Yankees baseball cap. Livy, it's me, Ruth Rose said. Olivia stared at Ruth Rose, then broke into a grin. Ruth Rose, you're so big. What are you up to these days? A man at the hotel gave us your name. What man? He was sort of old, wearing a red cap, Dink said. Livy chuckled. Freddie old? He's only 30. So why did he send you to see me? He told us you cleaned the rooms on the 3rd floor this morning, Dink said. Did you clean room 303? Livy Nugent shifted the baby to her other arm. Randy, please stop pulling on Mommy's leg. Why don't you go finish your lunch? Randy ran back into the apartment. No, Livy told Dink. Nobody slept in that room. The bed was still made this morning. The towels were still clean and dry. I remember because there were 2 rooms in a row that I didn't have to clean. 303 and 302. Room 302 had a do not disturb sign hanging on the doorknob. So I came home early, paid off the babysitter, and made our lunches. But Mr. Linkletter told us Wallace Wallace checked into room 303 last night, Ruth Rose said. Not the Wallace Wallace, the mystery writer. My kid sister devours his books. Dink nodded. He was supposed to sign books at the book nook this morning, but he never showed up. We even saw his signature on the hotel register, Ruth Rose said. Well, Wallace Wallace might have signed in, but he never slept in that room, Livy grinned, unless he's a ghost. I wonder if Mr. Linkletter could have made a mistake about the room number, Mavis suggested quietly. Livy smiled at Mavis. You must not be from around here. Mr. Linkletter never makes mistakes. So Wallace signed in, but he didn't sleep in his room, said Dink. There's a picture. So that woman right there is Libby, and she's holding her kids. And there's the kids trying to solve the mystery. That means someone must have kidnapped him before he went to bed, Josh said. Livy's eyes bugged. Kidnapped? Oh, Mr. Linkletter will have a fit. She imitated his voice. We have rules about kidnappings at the Shangri-La. Everyone except Dink laughed. All he could think about was Wallace, his favorite author, kidnapped. Suddenly, a crash came from inside the apartment. Oops, gotta run, Libby said. Randy's playing bulldozer with his baby sister's stroller again. I hope you find Wallace. My kid sister will die if he doesn't write another book. They walked slowly back to Main Street. Dink felt as though his brain was spinning around inside his head. Now he felt certain that Wallace had been kidnapped. But who did it? And when? And where was Wallace being kept? Guys, I'm feeling confused, he said. Can we just sit somewhere and go over the facts again? Good idea, Josh said. I always think better when I'm eating. I'm feeling a bit peckish too, Mavis said. I need a quiet cup of tea and a sandwich. Should we meet again after lunch? Ruth Rose looked at her watch. Let's meet at 2:00. Where? Josh asked. Back at the hotel. Dink peered through the glass door at Mr. Linkletter. Unless Maureen Higgins and Mr. Linkletter are both lying, he said. Wallace walked into the Shangri-La last night and never came out. And that is the end of chapter 6. I'm going to stop there, and tomorrow I will be reading chapter 7, chapter 8, and then the next day I'll read chapters 9 and 10. It'll be the end of our book. I love you guys so much, and I hope that you enjoyed the story. Thanks for listening, and have a great day reading your books and diving into some new books. Love you guys.